Hello everyone. In this session I want to show you how we can utilize Megascans within Blender and how we can modify the textures to blend two elements together. So I've got some multiple assets downloaded here from Quixel Megascans, and I'm going to show you how we can download the bridge soon. And we can see if I just zoom into these rocks and if I move this up and down, you'll notice that the sand texture actually interacts with this model. So if I move these rocks, we can see that the sand that I have as a texture underneath bleeds into the rock texture on top. So I want to show you how we can do this within Blender. But before we begin, you need to make sure that you have, first of all, Blender installed, and you can download that for free on their website. And you can also install the Quixel Bridge for free. So if you type in Quixel Bridge, you can download that. You can use the online version and you can download the textures manually. But ideally, if you're doing this from home, you have your own resource, then by all means, download the Quixel Bridge software. So once you've downloaded it, we need to make sure that we set our settings up. So let's go to settings here. And in the preferences in general, you need to make sure that you have your library path set to something where you're going to be able to access those files quite quickly, right? So on my C drive, it's quite full. So on my D drive, that's where I have all of my files. My C drive is for all of my software. So I've set the library path to the D drive, and I've made a folder called Megascans repository. So make sure that you set that up, otherwise you'll forget where it has been installed. And in the export settings as well, we need to change this to Blender, and there's a myriad of options here that we can export our models to. But we're going to select Blender, and here it will ask you to install the plugin. So it will automatically do that. If you press install, then that's going to install the plugin for Blender. Excellent. So to begin, I can go through, let's say, our surfaces, and you can select a bunch of surfaces here that are split into subsections. So let's say we go on to, let's go on to concrete, and then scroll down, and we have loads of concrete textures that are up to 8K actually. So there's an awful lot of detail to work with. But what we can also do is we can search by our selection. So if I select surfaces, then I can select sand. So type in sand, and now we can go through all of our sand assets, right? So this is in home, surfaces, sand, and then we can scroll through until we find the sand that we want. Now I found this really cool sand called Thai sand. So you can add that as a keyword as well. So I can type in Thai, and now I have all of the Thai sand textures. What you can also do is you'll notice I've got some little love hearts here. If you've got a texture that you're going to be using throughout the scene and you want to make sure that you can come back to it because maybe you've deleted it and then you want to come back to that texture, just make sure that you love heart this so you can go all the way down here to your favorites, and then we can find some of our favorite models and surfaces that we want to use. So I have used this one called Thai Rippled Sand, and let's just find this within the selection. So I'm going to type in surface again, surface section, sand, and then I'll type in Thai. And if you scroll down here, if you want to use the same texture that I'm using, it's this sand that looks slightly glossy, Thai Rippled Sand. And when you select on that, it's going to give you a little preview of what the sand can look like. And here I've already downloaded it, but if, for example, I select another texture, it will say download, and I've got this set to 4K. And you can go up to 8K. I think for now, 4K as a texture is pretty good. Here we've got this little cog. If you haven't got into the settings already, again, go into download settings so that we make sure we know exactly where we're exporting this to. I've got this set to FBX. You can set it to OBJ, but FBX is fine for now. And also go into those export settings and make sure that it is selected to Blender as an export. So once you've done that, we should be able to then export our textures to Blender. So let's try that. Let's go back into Blender, and I'm just going to create a new scene. So File and New. And General, don't save this. and now we have our classic cube. Okay, so for our shortcuts, if you hold the middle mouse button, we can pan around the object. If you hold shift, then we can move along the axes. And if you scroll with the middle mouse, then we can scroll in and out. Okay, so you just want to get used to that. You can almost use the middle mouse for absolutely everything, right? So I can move around, hold shift, pan around the axes, zoom in and out, and then without holding shift, I can pan around the object. So just get used to using that middle mouse as opposed to using a left click or right click. Right, so by default, we've got this camera in place. We can create our own camera later, so we can just go ahead and delete that. And we also have a light source within the scene. We don't need that either. We can delete that. Do we need the cube? No, we need a flat plane, so I can delete the cube. And now we just have a blank scene. So we can see here in the collection, there's absolutely nothing within the scene. So let's add a new object. Now to get to this shortcut, we can either go to Add here and then select Mesh and Plane. But the keyboard shortcut is Shift and A on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up the same panel. It's just a little bit quicker instead of going up here. So Shift and A, and then go to Mesh and Plane. Now this plane is quite small by default, so we can scale this up. And again, we've got the tools here where we can select the scale tool, but I'm going to use some of the shortcuts by pressing S on the keyboard, and I can just move my mouse from left to right and just scale this up. So something like that looks pretty good. Okay, and now we need to import our texture. So with this selected, I'm going to go back into Bridge, where we bridge, and I'm going to select Export. You'll notice it says Export to Blender, it's exporting, and then when it's done, it will say successful. Hopefully. If it doesn't, you may need to try it again. But now that's exported to Blender, you may think, okay, so where's the texture? Where's it gone? And that's because we haven't actually applied the texture yet. It's only sent the texture to Blender. So we need to apply it to this object. So here on the right hand side where we have our tools and settings options, we can go all the way down here to what looks like a beach ball. And this is the material properties. So if you select that, we can select this little material again. And here we can see that it has imported the Thai rippled sand. So now when I click on it, it is now selected onto our model. But again, we can't see it. And that's because we need to change this to a material preview view or a rendered view. And if you press Z on the keyboard or Z, then here we can bring up our options, which is essentially exactly the same as the options that are up here. So this second option here is our material preview, but if I press Z on the keyboard, I can do the exact same. So I can go to rendered, or I can press Z and go down to the material preview. And now we can see we've got this really nice sand texture onto our flat plane. If I just move this down, we can see that the light is interacting with the sand and it looks pretty darn nice. Right, so that's our sand. Let's import another model. So let's go back into our bridge. I'm going to remove Thai and sand. And instead of surfaces, I'm going to go to 3D assets. And I still want to keep it within the same vein. So I'm going to type in the Thai again. And it should bring up some rocks that are, again, within the same color palette. And I've selected these rocks. Now you can go ahead and select any other rock, and you don't need to use sand. You could use something like snow or dirt and select other objects within the scene. But for this demonstration, I'm going to use sand and use this Thai rippled sand. So let's select this object. And again, I favorited it. I've already downloaded this asset, but I haven't downloaded it at 4K. For models, at least just to place them within the scene, if they're going to be quite small, you don't really need them at 4K. Once you've downloaded an awful lot of Megascans, it can slow down your system, and those files itself are quite large. So 2K is perfectly fine for now. So I have downloaded that at 2K. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and press export, and it's going to send this straight to Blender. So that's currently exporting. We'll wait for it to say successful. There we go. Now we can go back into Blender and we can see that we have this within our scene. If I press S on the keyboard, I can scale this up, and here are our rocks. Brilliant. So let's use the move tool here. We can press E on the keyboard to move this. So let's scale this up. And we can push the rocks all the way down so that we can't see the sand. But what if we want this a little bit higher and we want this sand texture to blend in with this sand on this rock, right? So we need to try and blend these two textures together. And we can do this within the shader view. So if I select my sand and then go up to shading here, so we've got layout, modeling, sculpting, UV editing, texture painting, and shading. Then here is our shaded view. So in the background, we can see that we've got a lit HDRI. And here in the settings, we'll go all the way up to the top here. We can change our lighting setup. For now, I'm going to keep it by default. And you may want to increase the blur if you don't want to see the green or the trees in the background. Then we can just blur this a little bit more just so that we can't really see that. That looks fine. And let's start changing some of these settings. Now, the sand may be too small. You may want to increase the size of this sand, or at least the size of the texture. So we can do this within this shaded view. So here within our setup from Megascans, it's set up the texture tree. And here we've got this set to our normal map, which is then connected to a normal map tangent space into normal. So if you were to import your own textures, you could import all of them in by dragging and dropping them. And if you hold Shift and A, then that brings up our menu where we can add things like multiply, or what have we got there? We have normal, right? Normal map. So let's do normal map, and we can add it this way, and then we just connect them up. So color would be to color, and then normal to normal. Now we can go ahead and delete that. And we can also connect these up. So we've got roughness to roughness. We've got ambient occlusion, which is added to this mixer RGB. And we have the albedo map, which is the normal base color, which is then connected to color 1, color 2, and into base color. So it should do all of this by default every time that you add a texture into Blender via Bridge. It will automatically set all of this up. But what we want to do is we want to be able to tile this texture so that we can move this texture around. We may need to scale it up or again move it along the axes. So we can do that by selecting one of these textures, and let's just select the roughness for now. And if I press Ctrl T on the keyboard, then it will bring up the texture coordinates. So if you're coming from something like Unreal Engine, then this may feel a little bit more familiar to you. By using that texture coordinate, we can map the coordinate of that texture, and then we can scale it via the location, the rotation, and the scale. But we don't really want to do this manually. Ideally, we want to be able to very quickly move the texture within the scene instead of constantly having to go back into these settings here and moving all of these around. So what we can do is we can go to Shift and A and press search, and we can type in value. And this value will dictate the size of the scale in this example. Okay, so if I moved this backwards and forwards, you can just see that the roughness is moving across the scene. So let's just press Ctrl Z to get that back to its default. And we don't just want the texture coordinate to be mapped just to the roughness, so this needs to be connected to every single texture. So we're going to go from the vector to the normal vector, the vector to the vector of the ambient occlusion, and the vector to the albedo as well. Okay, so now all of those are selected. If I then move the value, we can see that we can change the scale, which is great. So like I said before, we can always go back into this, and if you need to modify this, then we can move this value for the scale. We could also move the location if we wanted to. But, you know, it's a little bit time consuming. Although it's only just one extra step, once you've got loads of these within a scene, you've got to constantly hunt, okay, where is it? Okay, there's the value, and I've got to change this. Ideally, you want something just within the scene that you can move around and change the texture that way. So what we can do is we can go up to our menu here. So we've got shader view. So this is our viewport. If you hold Shift and A, that's going to bring up our tools again. We can go to mesh and UV sphere. And we're going to map the texture to the UV sphere instead. So if I press G on the keyboard, then I can just move this sphere out away from our model. And I'm just going to press Control 1 just to smooth this out a little bit more. Okay, so we can see the lighting scenario on this sphere. So now we're going to go back into our sand, and I'm going to go down here. We notice that it says Object here. If I select this little color picker and then select the sphere, now it's mapped the object to the sphere. We're still connected to UV, and we don't want to change the UV. We want to map this to the object. And now you'll notice that the scale of this sand is much smaller. We may need to just change this back to default, so 0.5, and we can delete this sphere and then redo that again. So make sure that was set to default. And now if I scale this sphere up and down, so I press S, we'll notice that we're now affecting the scale of this sand, right? In the same way, if I press G, then I can move this around. Now, yes, you've then got a huge sphere within your scene, but when you render this, you won't see it. Okay, so there's this little icon here that looks like a little camera. If you select that, then it will not render when you hit render. Okay, so what you may want to do is go back and let's make this even smaller. So again, I can delete this object. Make sure this was set to its default value. If you're unsure, you can always just delete it. Press Shift A again, type in value, and make sure it was set to default. So back to scale. You can make this sphere perhaps a little bit smaller. You could even increase this size, like so. And then you can select your object. So color picker, select your object, make sure it's set to vector, and now when I scale this up, it's going to scale our texture. Pretty cool. Okay, so experiment with that, and yeah, you may enjoy using an object as opposed to going through all of the settings. I definitely find it much more useful to do it this way. Right. So that was our mapped object. Now let's go into our settings for our object within the scene. So we've changed the texture. Let's now change the object. Now we need to be able to add the texture of the sand onto this object. And we need to be able to input the texture of that sand into this material output of this object. So if we go back into our sand, we need to group all of our settings here and then apply it to this object. So even if I go back into my sand and I change some settings here, it will also affect how it changes the sand on this object as well, because it's going to be grouped. So we can do that by selecting everything within the scene here, apart from the material output. So all I've done is just held left click, dragged, and selected the whole thing. And we can press Control G on the keyboard. Now, if Control G doesn't work and it's not grouping, that's because you may need to go into the Edit and Preferences and just make sure that we've got these settings on. So we can type in Node here and make sure that the Node Wrangler is selected. If it's not selected, then it won't create those groups. So make sure that's on. And now when you press Control G, you'll see that the screen is now turned green and it has grouped the object. Now here there's a little arrow, and if we go back, we'll see that this is now our group. So we can change this, and let's change this to sand, because this is our sand texture. And if we need to go back into those settings, there's a little option here right next to sand. If you click that, then we can go back into our grouped settings. Excellent. So now that that is grouped, we can go back onto our object and we can start to change some of these settings. So we've got our material output, and that is connected to our albedo, our roughness and normal. So again, normal to normal, roughness to roughness, and albedo to the base color. And then this is coming out to the surface of that material, so out to the material output. But we need to add that sand texture onto our model. So if I just go ahead and hold Shift and A and press search, I can type in sand, and now it's found our grouped sand node. So if I just connected this straight up to surface, for example, and let's say that the model was then connected to something like volume, then we can see that the sand has then been applied to the entire model, right? So we can see that that texture is now entirely over our model, but obviously we don't want that. We don't want to have that in place. You may want this. Maybe you've got some textures where you want something where it looks like there's a bump and you want to apply that texture, then you could do it this way. Okay, so maybe this is snow and the entire thing is covered in snow, then you could include that model and then add the same texture. You could do it that way. But we want to be able to see our model's texture and also see the sand in place. So we're not going to just directly plug that in. Instead, we're going to use a mix shader. So we're going to go to Shift and A and press search and then go to mix shader. And we need to disconnect this. So this is going to go actually to our shader. Okay, so sand to shader. I'm just going to disconnect this one for now, just so it's not confusing. And I'm also going to disconnect this one for now, again, just so it's not so confusing. So we can see that we haven't got any textures on our scene now because it's not connected to the material output. So we have our sand. This is to our mix shader. And this shader can be connected to the surface, right? Now, the actual material can be selected and moved up to the shader, like so. So now all of these are hooked up. And we've got the same process here. We can now see the sand, but we can also see the sand that was on the original model, right? So we need to change some of these settings. So if you imagine you were going to create a gradient, because ideally, again, we want to see the texture that's underneath, but anything that's below it, we want to be the same sand texture. If you imagine you use something like a gradient tool within Photoshop, so it was predominantly dark at the bottom and then lighter at the top, we can use that with a color ramp in Blender. So it's going to tell Blender that anything that's going to be darker is going to be seen, anything that's lighter is going to be removed. Okay, so we can hold Shift and A and press search, and we can go to color ramp, spelled the American way, color ramp. And the color ramp is going to be set up to the FAC, right? So let's move that to color, FAC. And we need to change some of these settings. So the color ramp is also going to be set to a gradient texture because we want to add a subtle gradient. So Shift and A and type in gradient texture. And this gradient texture will be moved into, again, the FAC. And we need a texture coordinate to tell Blender exactly where this texture is. So we can go to Shift and A, type in texture coordinate, there we go. And then we can also select another object within the scene. So we can go to Object and Vector. And this time let's create a new object. So let's maybe create a cube. So Shift and A on our viewport, select a cube. Okay, so now that the cube is in the scene, we're going to hold G and move this out of the way. And we need to hook this cube up. So you can select the color picker here and then select the cube. And you'll notice that now the sand, we're starting to see some of the gradient texture there. So let's go back into our cube. And if I press G and move this, we can see that it's actually upside down. So let's go to our side view. So hold Alt to side view, and we're going to hold Control, left click, and then just flip this around like so. So let's move this here. If I hold G now, okay, so same thing, I need to just move this, hold Control and flip this around this way. Did I move that all the way around? Yes, I did. So now if I move this cube up, and let's go back into our view, you can see that the sand is actually starting to affect the object here. Pretty cool, right? So I can also scale this down. So let's scale this object down so that we see even more. So let's go and move this up. Again, we can start to see that sand merging into this object. Nice. So if we go back into our color ramp, then we can change some of these settings and just make it a little bit more harsh. So let's move this to, let's move it all the way back like this. I can select my cube and then move this up again. And maybe let's scale back up. Okay, so let's scale this one back up here. And now when we move this, we can see that it really starts to affect this model. And you can play around with the ramp settings here, so you can increase or decrease. Depends on how much of a color ramp that you want and how much of a gradient change you want within your scene. But look at that, how cool is that? So now when I actually select this object and I want to move it, let's just hold G, then we can see that the sand is actually starting to bleed into that object. So you can have something really subtle, maybe something like this, and you can see the sand is actually covered this model completely in this case. Very cool. Or we could also start to scale this. So maybe if we duplicated this, so Shift and D, and then move this over here, we could perhaps rotate it just so it doesn't look exactly the same. And then we could scale it up like this. And just, yeah, play around with it. If I just move it in, we can see again the texture starts to bleed into the other texture. Absolutely amazing. Right, excellent. So let's just go ahead and delete that. And let's clean this up a little bit. So we've got a soft gradient here, but ideally we need even more color ramps connected to the scene just to create a little bit more of a texture, because it's a little bit blurry here. So let's do that. So let's just move this ramp a little bit further down. And again, this is all dictated by the cube, so we can move this cube up a little bit more, just so it looks a little bit more severe. There we go. It's a harsher line. Let's go back into our object and let's change some of these settings here. So we've got the material output. We've got the mixer shader. This is going up to our color ramp here. And we've got our sand. So let's just keep this all nice and organized. And we can create multiple ramps. So this one, let's bring this down here. Let's bring the texture coordinate down a little bit more as well. And let's bring this color ramp up here. And let's try and split these off. So we can do this by holding Shift and A and then searching for a mix RGB instead of the mix shader. And we're going to add multiple colors together. So this color can now go into this FAC. Okay, this is now disconnected. And we can select our gradient map to another color ramp. And you can just continuously add more and more color ramps. So I can change these settings as we go along. So let's maybe make it a little bit darker here. And instead of mix, we want to set this to subtract. Where are we? Subtract right here. So we're going to subtract that value. And let's just add more color ramps. So let's go to color ramp again. And this color ramp will be selected to FAC. So the factor. Let's just move these two over just so we've got a little bit more space and so we don't get too confused. Let's add another color ramp. Color ramp. And then we need to hook all of these together. So we've got the color against the FAC and then this color to color 1. We need to add some sort of noise into the scene, and we can just play around with these color ramps and see what that's starting to do. So let's move the darkness down a little bit. Let's move the brightness down. And with these color ramps, the great thing about it is you can just have total customizable textures just by moving these backwards and forwards. So again, if it was, say, snow or the sand has blown over these rocks, then we could play around with these ramps and create that effect. So that looks pretty good. Let's move this back just a little bit more so it's a little bit more harsh, like so. Let's bring this one back a little bit more, and let's create a noise texture as well. So if you hold Shift and A, we can type in noise. So we've got a noise texture, and we want to add some sort of gradient noise change. So it's a little bit soft at the moment. It just blurs into the next image. So let's create a little bit of noise, a little bit more of a texture. So I'm going to set the factor to factor, so FAC to FAC, and I also need to map this with a texture coordinate. And hopefully you remember to create the texture coordinate as a shortcut. You can hold Control and T on the keyboard, and it automatically creates the mapping and texture coordinate. So that should connect all of those together. That's set to 3D. There's your mapping. There's your mapping texture coordinate. And then we have all of our ramps. And we can just start to play around with this. So now we can see we've actually got this texture on here. So if I just move this backwards and forwards, we can see it's really nice subtle texture where it goes from soft, and then we've got a little bit of sand that's just kicked up on these lower surfaces of the rock. Very nice. Okay, so now all we need to do is just customize our texture. So you can constantly go backwards and forwards in these color ramps and just make some changes if you need to. So it's a little bit soft, maybe a little bit harsher like that. Maybe let's move this backwards and forwards, and we can start to see these really nice changes between the darker areas and then these softer sandy areas. And then of course we can go back into our cube and we can continue to move this backwards and forwards until we get the result that we want. So I think that looks pretty cool. Let's maybe make that a little bit softer around about here, like so. And that's it. That's how you blend these two textures together. And the model now interacts with the sand texture. So I move this up and down, we can see that it actually starts to bleed into this texture. Very, very cool. So you could have duplicates of this, again, Shift and D, and maybe some of these areas are just very low, right? So if I just hold, in fact, let's rotate this. And then maybe scale this, so maybe even scale it down and then move it up. Look at that, it almost looks like it's actually coming out of the sand, right? Very cool effect. And you don't have to stop there. You could increase, you could actually import another model. So let's go into Bridge, and you would duplicate all of these settings here and then copy and paste it onto the new model. You could also create a group of this if you wanted to, so you could select all of these and create a new group, but it might be easier just to copy and paste all of them and input it that way. So let's go ahead and go to our bridge, and let's download some other assets. I believe I've got this one downloaded. No, I haven't. Let's see what's on my favorites and see what else I've downloaded. Okay, let's maybe just go back then and let's try something else. So again, let's go to Thai and let's see what else we have. These are quite cool. This is good. Wow, look at that one. Thai Beach Rocks. Let's try that one maybe. So again, 2K, let's download this. And it can take a while. It can take up to 5 minutes depending on how large it is, but usually it's 30 seconds to a minute. Again, it just depends on the resolution and how big that file is and on your internet speed. So now that's exported to 2K, we can export this. and then that's going to go straight over to Blender. So successful. And now we can scale this up. And obviously this is now back to its default. So we're not going to see that texture bleed into one another. Let's maybe move this one over here. So it looks something like that. Let's move it over a little bit. So we would go back into our object here where we've made all of these settings. I can just shift click, and if I need to select any more, I would continue to hold shift. So let's just go back there. Let's click all of these, this one, and the mixer shader. We've already got the material output already, so let's just Control C. Let's go back onto this one, paste it, and then we just need to change these around. So the shader goes to the surface, and the principle goes to the shader. Okay, so we've got a mix shader. The FAC, so the factor, goes up to our color ramp, and the principle goes to shader, and then the shader to surface. Okay, so now when I move this object around, it's doing the same thing. We can see this sand starting to bleed into this model. So let's just move this and maybe even scale it down. In fact, let's see what it looks like if I scale this way up like this. Again, look at that. If I just move this down, you can see that any of those lower sections are starting to bleed into the texture. Very, very cool. Excellent. So that is the entire part of this tutorial. We can then move into, say, adding some water effects onto it. But yeah, I would say just for now, experiment with this, use different textures and objects. Like I said, maybe experiment with snow, with rocks, or grass, or grit and dirt. So experiment with it and have fun. This is pretty darn amazing. If you then want to render this, then we could go ahead and change some of these settings. Now I do have a different lighting scenario. This is just set to its default lighting scenario. I do also have an atmosphere plugin, which is about £50 to buy. I may be able to put this onto one of the chats so that you can install this plugin. But if you go onto atmosphere and then physical atmosphere, if I then go to the render panel, then it's going to render much nicer, right? So now we've got a low sunset. If I go here, then I can move this lighting around. And now we've got some really nice lighting. Okay, so I can go into the settings here, maybe add a little bit of ambient occlusion, screen space, reflections, and I can increase and decrease the render size. And now we're seeing this almost photorealistic, right, compared to the original lighting source. So this was before, and this is now after. So you may want to look at some different plugins. There's loads available online just to create some really nice lighting scenarios. You can of course add your own lights into the scene, but I like to use this plugin because it's much faster. Awesome. I will leave it there, and I look forward to seeing your work. Okay, take care for now. Goodbye.